let's try to finish the series on the Erev Rav. So we've already said a lot. In part one, we talked about the origins of the Erev Rav, where it came from, the connection to Egypt, the various ideological red flags, and the general qualities of the Erev Rav. Then in part two, we talked about the 5 types. The Zohar tells us there are 5 specific manifestations of the Erev Rav. It's all Erev Rav ideology, it's all Erev Rav mentality, but it expresses itself in 5 different ways that can be actually quite different. And the acronym was Negara, right, a bad plague. So there's Nephilim, Giborim. I'll review it a bit later on. It'll come up again. So that's what we did in part 2. And again, I'll reiterate that we're not talking about specific people. We're talking about a certain ideology that we want to confront, because this ideology is very negative and divisive and extremist and is pulling the people apart, pulling the nation apart. And we can't bring Geula. We need unity. We need Ahavat Chinam. But we can't do that when there's these false ideologies that are pulling us apart. And the Zohar, if you remember, specifically says that the Erev Rav actually delays the redemption, delays Geula more than anything else, more than all the idolaters of the world. Like, this is the main roadblock. This is the main thing that's preventing Geula. So we all want Geula. We're all praying for Mashiach every day, for redemption, for peace, and all of that. But how do we get there? We have to confront it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have to actually talk about these things and explore it and understand it deeply. That's the whole point of these shiurim. It's uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about it. I've avoided it for a long time. But it has to be done, because the Erev Rav is what's delaying the coming of Mashiach and Geula. And we see examples of this in the Tanakh itself, of how the Erev Rav prevents Mashiach from coming. And I want to just highlight one example. One very clear, the clearest example, I think, of Erev Rav in Tanakh, later in Nach, preventing a potential Mashiach from being realized. And it's going to also answer some other questions that I got recently, many of the same questions. How do we understand who is Erev Rav and who isn't? The leaders from the flock, the victims from the perpetrators. Like, if somebody is espousing certain Erev Rav beliefs and practices like we discussed before, does that mean that they're like an Erev Rav soul? Is this the reincarnation of, those people of Yunus and Yumbrus and these Egyptians? All the things that we discussed before? Or are they just victims? How do we differentiate between them? How many Erev Rav really are there? And who are the leaders? Those are all questions that came up. I think this example will also answer these questions. So if you remember in part 1, quick review, we saw our sages gave different opinions for how many possible Erev Rav there were originally in the Exodus generation. Do you remember those numbers? What did they say? It was based on that verse, Chamushim Alu, right? That the Israelites came out armed, Chamushim, but then our sages read that as maybe as chamesh, as maybe a fifth of the Israelites, or echad michamishim, or a 50th. So there's this opinion that maybe as many as a fifth of the people that came out of Egypt had Erev Rav ideology. Some say not a fifth, but a 50th. There was even an opinion of maybe a sixth. It depends on also how many Israelites actually left Egypt, because that's also subject to debate. The Torah says there was 600,000 fighting-aged men. Does that mean that there was maybe 3 million people overall? And then there's another tradition that maybe at the time there were 15 million people and only a fifth came out. So only 3 million out of the 15 million Israelites actually came out of Egypt. So exactly how you apply this ratio, it's going to make a big difference. There's one Mechilta which I didn't quote. I put it in the slides last time, but I didn't quote it. So it's on the pasuk, V'gam Erev Rav ala itam. The Erev Rav came out of Egypt. How many were there? Rabbi Ishmael says, 120 ribua. So 120 myriads. Remember, a myriad is 10,000. So 120 10,000s of Erev Rav, which is, if you do the math, 1.2 million. Good, that's one opinion. Rabbi Akiva Omer, 240. He says, no, double, 240 myriads, which is 2.4 million. And the biggest, most liberal opinion, Rabbi Natan Omer, 360 ribua, that 360, so that's 3.6 million. So the largest possible estimate that you have, which is Rabbi Natan's, is 3.6 million people were somehow associated with Erev Rav, or had fallen victim to Erev Rav ideology at that time. But how many actual Erev Rav leaders were there? The actual perpetrators that brought forth this false ideology. Not the victims, the Israelites that were sucked into it, that were brainwashed or that were tempted into this ideology, but how many actual Erev Rav leaders were there? And the Torah actually tells us, not explicitly, but if you read what happened with the golden calf, remember, the people who built the golden calf were the Erev Rav, led by Yunus and Yumbrus, which we described in part 1. There, the Torah actually does specify a number. What is that number over there? 3,000. Good. We know it tells us, if we in chapter 32 of Shemot, Vayar Moshe et ha'am ki faruahu. That's how it starts. Moshe saw the people that they were farua, they were wild and out of control. Remember the code word of ha'am. The Zohar tells us every time you see in the Torah where it says ha'am, and not Am Yisrael or Bnei Yisrael or Beit Yaakov or some other name, that means that it's the Erev Rav. Ha'am means Erev Rav. So again, it's consistent. Vayar Moshe et ha'am. Moshe saw the Erev Rav. Ki faruahu, and it's gone wild. And then it even says, Faroa Aaron. Lem shimtza bekameim. That Aaron himself, the Torah blames Aaron for allowing this thing to happen. And we talked about this in part 1 as well, where Rabbi Shimon says, Aaron, how could you do this? Chasida Kadisha, God's anointed one, God's holy one. How did you let this on your watch? How did you let this catastrophe happen? And we talked about how even the Gdolei Ador, even Aaron, could be manipulated into allowing these sins to happen. Nobody is immune necessarily from the Erev Rav. And we'll see later today how deep it can infiltrate. And it actually says, the word that's used is Fra'oah, which is, it says that Aaron was, it's literally spelled like Pharaoh. Pei, Reish, Ayin, He. The Torah is telling you something here, right? It's like as if the people were like Pharaoh. They're bringing their Egyptian idolatry into the Israelite camp. It's the exact same word. It actually says as if you can read it as if it's Pharaoh. It's like Pharaoh, like Aaron was almost like allowing this pharaonic ideas to infiltrate Judaism. And Moshe says, Vayamod Moshe b'shara machaneh. Moshe arises and says, Mila Hashem, Elai, Veyasfu elav kol bnei Levi, who's with me? And the Levites assembled onto Moshe, and then he told them, go out and eliminate all the Erev Rav, Veyasu bnei Levi kidvar Moshe, Veyipol min ha'am bayom ha'u ki 3,000 ish. That the Levites, with Moshe, struck down 3,000 people specifically. And we also read that there was a plague, and we also read that Moshe ground up the golden calf and had the people drink it, which was symbolic of what the Torah, reminiscent of what the Torah later says is the sotah procedure, right? If a woman was suspected of adultery, they would make a special juice mixture and she would drink it. And if she was guilty of adultery, it's like her belly would explode and she would die on the spot. And if she was innocent, then everything would be fine and she'd be blessed and she'd have more children and so on. So Moshe basically does a sotah procedure. Rashi explains all this. Rashi writes that there were 3 things in the aftermath of the golden calf. Rashi says those that were clearly visibly sinning, the actual leaders, the perpetrators, the ones that were warned not to do it and they did it anyways, they were given the halachic warning and they still went ahead and did it publicly without shame. Those were the Erev Rav, those were the 3,000. They were exterminated by sword. And then those that sinned, there were witnesses, they sinned publicly, but they were not warned. They were killed by a plague. And the ones that nobody saw, they didn't sin publicly at all, so nobody knew, but they sinned in their heart. They were part of this, but not visibly. That's when Moshe tested them with this solution, and those that were guilty died. There was 3 different people. The people that, the Erev Rav, that were open about it, and unashamed, and not repentant. The people that were open about it but were kind of just tempted into it and they didn't really know, they weren't given a warning, they were just out of ignorance did it, those died in a plague. And then the ones that didn't sin visibly but did in their heart and were kind of going along with it had the sotah procedure done to them and they drank. Okay, so the actual number of Erev Rav was 3,000. I think that teaches us that there's maybe 3,000 Erev Rav actual Erev Rav souls that reincarnate in every generation. Because remember what the Zohar and the Arizal say is that Moshe and the Erev Rav reincarnate again and again in every generation. And it's this cosmic historical battle throughout all of history. That Moshe keeps coming back in every generation And the Erev Rav keeps coming back in every generation. And some might see that as there's a potential Mashiach in every generation who's trying to defeat the Erev Rav ideology, but it's never kind of working out. So far, it's almost like it hasn't happened. The Erev Rav always wins, and we'll see more examples of this, until the end of days, when the Erev Rav will be defeated, and Mashiach, the potential Messiah, will become the actual Messiah. And so I think there's an example of this very clearly in Tanakh. Where else do we see in Tanakh a group of 3,000 Jews betraying the potential Mashiach of the generation? To my knowledge, there's only one place in Tanakh where it's clearly, explicitly says again, 3,000 Jews are doing something. It's with the story of Shimshon, Samson. We talked about this before, if you remember, in the class on the snake, the dragon, and the Messiah, that Shimshon was the potential Mashiach of his generation. He could have been the Messiah in his days. And we learned that originally from Jacob's blessing. Remember, Yaakov gave a blessing to his children before he passed away. And what did he tell Dan, his son Dan? Yehi Dan nachash alai derech. May Dan be a snake upon the road, and he's going to bite the horse's heel. You remember this? And then the blessing ends, Li yishuatcha kiviti Hashem. I pray for your salvation. That's strange. So Yaakov gives a blessing to Dan and says, oh God, I await your salvation. What do you mean? What does Dan have to do with salvation? And of course, Rashi there identifies, well, he was talking about Shimshon. This was talking about Samson, who was like a snake, who was actually trying to defeat the Philistines in all kinds of roundabout ways. And Li'ishotcha kiviti Hashem, the Midrash famously says, Midrash Rabbah, Lefi shaya Yaakov avinu ro'eh oto, he saw Shimshon, the sabur bo shehu melech HaMashiach. Yaakov knew that he was the Messiah of his potential Messiah of his generation. There's one potential in every generation. Kevan shera oto shemet, but when he saw that Shimshon died, Amar af zemet. Li'ishotcha kiviti Hashem. This one also died, unfortunately. Another potential Messiah that wasn't able to succeed. Li'ishotcha kiviti Hashem. I still await your salvation. And we talked about the symbolism of Nachash and Mashiach many times, right? Gematria is the same. Nachash is 358 like Mashiach, because one of the symbols of Mashiach is the snake, the serpent bearer, the serpent holder, the constellation of Ophiuchus. There's all this snake imagery with Mashiach, also with the Erev Rav. And we're going to talk more about that. So when Yaakov talks about Yehi Dan Nachash alai derech, may the judge, Dan is a judge, may kind of like the final judge, Mashiach, who will judge with his smell, be like a snake and be able to kind of do it in a roundabout way and finally defeat the Erev Rav from the back. And Noshech ikvei sus, he is going to bite the horse's heel and the rider will fall back. So Shimshon was the potential Mashiach. And remember, of course, amazingly, we talked about this in that class on the snake, that the Tanakh Dafka specifically describes that Shimshon moved the gates of Gaza. He defeated Gaza and he lifted up its gates. Remember this? So there's a connection to Gaza as well in the narrative of the end of days and what Mashiach has to do. There's a Gaza connection, and that's going to come up again later today. So why is this significant to the Erev Rav and the 3,000? Look what it says about Shimshon. What happened to Shimshon? Who betrayed Shimshon originally? Even before Delilah. Who originally betrayed Shimshon? V'yardu 3,000 ish mi Yehuda. And 3,000 people from Judea came. El Seif Sela Eitam, which is the place where Shimshon was in hiding. V'yamru l'Shimshon, alo yadata ki moshlim banu plishtim, u'ma zot asita lanu. Like, why are you causing trouble for us? The Philistines rule over us. Galut mentality. We're okay for the Plishtim to rule over us. Don't create tension right now. Think about what's happened recently in Israel with certain Rebbeim saying, it's better that if we were ruled by Arabs. You heard this? Some rabbis in Israel who were like anti-IDF, anti-war, and anti-Zionist, anti-government, they went so far as to say, it was great when the Arabs ruled over us. Why? What's the problem? Let's go back to Arabs ruling over us. This is what these Judeans said. The 3,000 of these Erev Rav Judeans are saying, what? The Plishtim are Moshlim Banu. Why are you causing trouble? It's better that the Philistines rule over us.
Were they the tribe of Yehuda?
Yeah, it says Mi Yehuda, Dafka. 3,000 Jews, Judeans, came to Shimshon and said, why are you causing trouble? Let the Philistines do their thing. And Shimshon says, look, I'm only doing Vayomer lehem kasher asu li ken asiti lahem. We're fighting back. We're fighting back against these oppressors. Don't you see that? We have to fight back against the Philistines. We have to defeat Gaza. You can't be passive about this. And what did they do? The 3,000 Judeans, Ve'ya'asruhu bishnaim avotim. They put him in handcuffs, avotim chadashim, and ropes, and new ropes, ve'alu min hasala, and they took him out of his hiding place and they gave him up to the Philistines. This was the potential Mashiach of the generation. I think this is another example of, again, the Torah doesn't say stam 3,000. There was 3,000 people named clearly as 3,000 at the golden calf. And again, 3,000 Judeans come to confront Shimshon and say, hey, stop what you're doing. We don't want this. We're okay with the Philistines. Remember what we said about the 5 types of Erev Rav, right? The first one that the Zohar describes there is the Amalekim. The Amalekim that collaborate with Israel's enemies, that collaborate with those who want to destroy Israel. That's the Amalekim. Their souls, the Zohar says, is from the pre-flood generation. They collaborate. The Zohar specifically uses the word Hamas. They collaborate. They bring Hamas upon Israel. This is it, right? This is what Shimshon dealt with. Judeans that are coming to him and they arrested him and delivered him to the Philistines. He was able to fight them off at that time. That's not what did him in. It was later the thing with Delilah. But that was Shimshon, who was the potential Mashiach of the generation. And that just, I think, solidifies the point of there's maybe 3,000 actual Erev Rav leaders, and the rest are just victims. And we have to get those victims out. That's our job, really, now at the end of days, specifically to get all these good people that have succumbed to this false ideology. Our job is to really extricate them from that Erev Rav mentality. So the Amalekim were the first type. Just to quickly review the 5 types of Erev Rav, the Amalekim was the first type, and then the second type was the Nephilim. Nephilim are the fallen ones that it says they can't control themselves by looking at Bnot Adam, like it says in the Torah, the Bnei HaElohim, great people who see Bnot HaAdam, sons of man, and can't control themselves and do all kinds of sexual sins and sexual harassment and whatever it is, and they groom people and they take advantage of converts and they take advantage of whoever it is, kids in a camp, in a school, in a Beis Yaakov, in a yeshiva. It could be boys or girls, various pedophiles, and so on. Unfortunately, those are the worst, and the Zohar actually says these are the ones that have no tikkun and they're never coming back, and God just will destroy them in this world. And the Zohar actually says of the Erev Rav in another place, I put it in the slides before, but I never quoted it, but I'll quote it now, that these Erev Rav make themselves impure with a shifra and a goya and a nida and a zona. That's what the Zohar actually uses those terms. They make themselves impure with these, and they're like unashamed about it. You think they're righteous and religious, but they make themselves impure with these things. And again, many people have emailed me and told me their stories. Mamash this, exactly this. When I first read this in the Zohar, I couldn't believe it. What do you mean? Religious people are going to make themselves impure with a shifra and a goya and a zona and a nida. But it's mamash this. A convert who's a goya, before she converts, is a goya and a nida. And rabbis who take and harass them in the process of conversion. And rabbis, I mentioned before, who take a pilegish or a shifra, as the Zohar says. They actually do these things, and it's many more than you think, and most of them don't get caught. And they get away with it, and it's really terrible. So they mamash do this. Don't think the Zohar is exaggerating. They look on the outwardly they look like great rabbis, and they might have a big following, and they're, in the kiruv world and whatever, but they make themselves impure with a shifra and a goya and a nida, just like the Zohar says. And zona also, in other cases. They'll even stoop to that level. And interestingly here, where the Zohar actually talks about these Erev Rav, the Nephilim types that make themselves impure with all these women that are forbidden to them, it actually uses a verse in Ishayahu as a proof or as a support, and the verse is Ki mishoresh nachash yitzet tzefa. That again, it's using the snake symbolism. That Mashiach is a snake, and he's able to defeat them with they're snakes, and Mashiach's a snake, and the snake is able to defeat the snake. The 358 of Mashiach and the 358 of Nachash. And it actually has to do with Moshe and Pharaoh, because Moshe and Pharaoh were both symbolized by snakes. You know how the Pharaoh wore this thing on his head that had a little cobra on it? And Moshe has a staff that turned into a snake. So Moshe's symbol he had 2 staffs that were snakes. The original one, and then the Nachash Nechoshet, the copper staff snake, if you remember, the healing staff. So Moshe has a snake, and his staff is symbolized by a snake, and the Pharaoh has a staff that turns into a snake and wears this little headdress with a cobra on it, and they're both like 2 snakes, and one's called the twisted snake, the Nachash HaKalaton, in the language of the Tanakh, and Moshe is the Nachash Bariach, the straight snake. Moshe is straight, and Pharaoh's twisted. They're both snakes, and the straight snake swallows up the twisted snake. And remember, we, Israel, are Yashar El. straight to God. We have to be the straight serpent, the good one, not the twisted one, not the impure one, not the manipulating one, not the Erev Rav Nachash, but the Nachash of the Mashiach Nachash, the proper one, the straight serpent, the serpent of Moses, the healing serpent, the Nachash Nechoshet, that's the one. So that was part number 2. The third type of Erev Rav is the Giborim, which are the ones that are Anshei Shem, trying to make a name for themselves, trying to make money, right? The Zohar, if you remember, said that they build fancy yeshivas and kollels and nice Torah scrolls, and they always ask for money for it. They use that to make money. They make a business out of Torah, out of shuls and kollels and yeshivas and beis medrashos, and they want fame and fortune. They're like the Tower of Babel generation. Their souls stem from the Tower of Babel generation. Let's make a name for ourselves. They want to be famous. So we see that all over the world today, everywhere. It's probably the most common type of Erev Rav, and social media has only exacerbated this problem, because social media, everybody wants to be famous now, everybody has a platform, everybody wants to be an influencer, everybody wants to have 1 million followers, and unfortunately that temptation has struck many rabbis and Jewish educators as well, who are doing all kinds of things on social media that they shouldn't be doing, and often even buying fake subscribers. I've seen this a few times. You see a rabbi that has like 100,000, 200,000 subscribers, but no views. Like, how is it possible? Because people are buying fake subscribers. They want to make themselves look more famous than they actually are. And it's funny, it's sad. Sometimes you see like a rabbi has a few thousand subscribers. Good. And then I see a few weeks later, I come back, now he has 60,000 subscribers. What happened? Nothing happened. No views, nothing changed. Suddenly overnight, a person got 50,000 subscribers. They paid, they got fake subscribers, fake accounts, bot B-O-T, and they want to make themselves look more famous than they actually are. This is the same problem of Anshei Shem, of people seeking honor and influence that they don't have. Right? I have a friend who does social media stuff. He has a marketing business, and he told me, like, one of these rabbis came up to him and said, like, I want you to, make me a millionaire. That's what he told him, straight up. And like, put the Torah out there, but make me famous, make me millions. I say this not necessarily because I think they're Erev Rav. I just want to put it out there for anybody who listens that our sages say something really important. 2 things. First of all, the Torah says, Midvar sheker tirchak. You should detach yourself, make yourself as far as possible from anything that's not true. Any bit of falsehood, Dvar sheker, any bit of a lie, make sure you be as far away from it as possible. So how can you build your Torah platform on a lie, of fake influence, of pretending you have more followers than you actually do? That's first of all. But the other thing, our sages say that a person who's always chasing after honor is always eluding him. And a person who's running away from honor is always chasing after him. That's important to remember, right? So some people didn't get that memo. Stop chasing after honors, and just do it l'shem shamayim. Do it for the actual mitzvah of it, and not for the fame and fortune. That's important to remember. So that's the giborim that use Torah for profit. They want fame and fortune. They want honor. And the last 2 groups were the Rephaim and the Anakim, which the Zohar says are equal, if you remember, like opposite sides of a scale, and they pull the Jewish world in opposite directions. And I made the suggestion that Rephaim are those who weaken. Rephaim means weak. They weaken Torah by repealing everything, and you see that on the far left in the Reform world. And the Anakim, which the Zohar described as being very strong, and putting it uses a verse that talks about putting a big heavy necklace on your neck, that the Anakim are those who put too much of a burden on Torah. And that's the ultra-Orthodox extreme, that pull Judaism too far to the right, way more than halachically required, all kinds of unnecessary stringencies and fences that are way too far. So you have 2 extremes of people pulling Judaism in 2 opposite extremes and ripping it apart. And that was the horseshoe theory that we talked about, that the far left and the far right are a lot more similar than it seems. They might seem like they're opposites, but they're actually right next to each other on the horseshoe. And we want to be in the golden middle. Like the Rambam says, the Midah Beinonit is the best path for a Jew. Like the Mishnah says, we need to go on the path of Tiferet. The Sfirah of Israel is the Sfirah of Tiferet. Right? Today was, in Sfirat HaOmer, was Tiferet Shebegvura. Right? The 10th day of Sfirat HaOmer is Tiferet Shebegvura. It's about having balance in in severe balance, balance in gvura, in restraint, in strength, in severity. So our path is Tiferet. Remember, the Zohar says that God sent Moshe the letter Vav, because Vav is the letter of Tiferet. Vav is this line, it's a perfectly center line, and God gave Moshe the Vav, and it comes back with him in every generation to help him fight the Erev Rav. What is the cure for the Erev Rav extremist ideology? Balance. It's coming back to the center. Not too far left, not too far right. Goldilocks, just right in the middle. It's the Vav. That's what we want. That's what God gave. The Zohar says God gave Moshe the Vav to help him defeat the Erev Rav. So we want to walk the middle path, like the Mishnah says, Kol shi tiferet leoseh v'tiferet lo min ha'adam. And this is actually our segue into how did we get here? That's where we ended off last time. How do we get to this point where Judaism is being ripped apart by these two opposite extremes? Where did this reform come from, and where did this ultra-orthodoxy come from? Because these are new things. This didn't exist throughout history. This is something that developed in the last 250 years. How did we get here? That was our question. And I think that Rephaim and Anakim, this is exactly the segue into this discussion of how do we have these two extremes, both of which are doing Chilul Hashem and pushing people away from Judaism, and also fanning the flames of anti-Semitism. Because if you look at anti-Semitic literature, it's always this. Who do they point the finger at, the anti-Semites? Not that I'm not excusing the anti-Semites. There's always going to be haters who hate because they hate or whatever. I'm not excusing them. But what's fanning the flames of the haters? What do they use to spread their hateful ideology? You look at it. They use these extremists. This tiny percentage, this few percent of Jews on the extremes, they clip their videos, they take pictures, and they take their stuff, whether it's the extreme left, pushing various, whatever it is, the transgenderism and all that stuff, or it's the extreme right. And the anti-Semites use this. They take some like ultra-Orthodox, they'll clip it. They'll find the shiur on YouTube, and they'll clip from it where he'll say something nasty about Goyim. And say, look, you see, this is what the Jews think of us. No, it's not. This is a moron who's misquoting things and doesn't understand authentic Judaism. One of these Erev Rav. But they take that, and then they make these video clips. I'm sure you've seen them. People share them all over on WhatsApp and Facebook. These montages of various extremists saying stupid things. And what do you think that does? That brings more anti-Semitism. That brings more hate. And the people, the Gentiles don't know. It's a tiny, tiny minority. They don't realize. And then who gets hurt at the end? Then some idiot with a gun will walk into a kosher supermarket or into a Jewish school and will hurt innocent people that have nothing to do with these extremists. That's why it's so important for us to talk about this. We cannot sweep it under the rug because we're all actually getting hurt from it. This is the stuff that's fueling this Erev Rav ideology on the two extremes is what's fueling anti-Semitism, and then we get hurt. The 95% of people that have nothing to do with it, that are in the middle, are getting attacked, So that's why it's all the more important to talk about it. That's what our sages said in the verse in Yeshayahu, "Macharivaych mimech yitz'u," that those who destroy you will come out of you. Isaiah meant that in the sense that in the end of days, your destroyers will be defeated and you'll finally have peace. But our sages also signed that Macharivaych, those who destroy you, are actually coming from within you. Mimech yitz'u. The people that are causing a lot of the damage that's coming to the Jewish people is from within, unfortunately, the Jewish people, these Erev Rav ideologies. That's why we really have to confront it and get rid of it. So how did we get to this point? The easiest answer to say is, well, we know the Erev Rav reincarnates in every generation, so it's just, this is the generation, they just reincarnate, that's it. It's just a spiritual phenomenon. They come back in every generation, and in our generation, which is at the end of days, this is the time of Geulah, and this is when they're the strongest, like the Zohar says, that in the end of days, the Erev Rav will give their final push. So it'll be the worst ever. It's never been this bad in Jewish history, and it's just a natural symptom of being at the end of days. And the Erev Rav's always reincarnated, and now we're here. That's the simplest answer. But what I want to do is, can we actually find that's true, that is the answer. But the question is, how did it happen? How did this happen that in the last 200 years, we have this explosion of Erev Rav on both sides? Can we find a natural mechanism? Can we find an actual historical explanation? Not just a spiritual, metaphysical thing that it just happened. can we find a historical point where this began and how it happened? You could say that it's an organic, natural development. In the 1700s, in Europe in particular, most Jews had it really bad. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of persecution. So reform, Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, and reform emerged at that time in with positive intentions to try to improve the plight of Jews, to get Jews out of poverty, to get Jews more educated, more into society. They thought maybe if we integrate Jews that there will be less persecution. Originally, their intentions were good. So you could say that that's how it started, but then once they started reforming things, the other side went like, oh, we can't be associated with that, so let's go in the opposite direction. So Orthodoxy took a turn to the right and said, well, nobody wanted to be associated with those who change things, so they went the other way. And then they just kept feeding off each other, going slowly trending towards opposite extremes. Orthodox didn't want to be associated with reform, and now this is a problem that still exists today, where Orthodox rabbis are afraid to say anything new or creative or original because they might be branded as a reformer. You say something different, oh, you're a reformer. And vice versa. And people in the reform world don't want to be associated with Orthodoxy. If they try to be a little conservative, then it's like they lose their progressive followers. They're afraid to be seen as not progressive somehow, right? So it's just like, you can say that it's just a natural trend. It's just like this evolution that one side keeps veering to the right, one side keeps veering to the left, and then the Holocaust and Zionism just exacerbated it. After the Holocaust, there were those on the left that said, you know what? It's dangerous to be a Jew, so many people just abandoned their Judaism entirely. Judaism is just a cultural thing. I want nothing to do with it. Or they were angry at God. How did God let this happen? And abandoned it. And then on the other side, the more Orthodox side said, no, well, if the Holocaust happened, that means God is mad at us. That means we're not religious enough. So we got to do even more. We got to be even more ultra-Orthodox, be even more stringent. So you can see how the Holocaust could exacerbate it, and Zionism exacerbated because neither the Haredi or the Reform wanted anything to do with Zionism. Both Reform was originally very anti-Zionist, and Orthodoxy was very anti-Zionist. So you can see how it just accelerated these trends. And we talked about that in the class on the hidden history of Zionism, about how, again, the two extremes, the two sides of the Jewish world are both kind of anti-Zionist. Depends. Political Zionism, once it was taken over by secular people and Herzl, and they tried to detach religion out of it. The original Zionism, though, as we discussed in that class on the hidden history of Zionism, the original Zionism was actually a religious thing. So that's one way to explain it, that it was just a natural kind of historical, social development. And that's how most historians and scholars and experts, that's how most of them would probably explain it. But could there be something else? Could there be perhaps maybe even a conspiracy to try and destroy Judaism? Now, I don't like conspiracy theories so much. And I said in part 1 and part 2 that Erev Rav is not a conspiracy. It's not a secret cabal. It's not a secret society that meets every so often to try to do terrible things and manipulate and infiltrate. I don't believe that's what it is. Again, Erev Rav is an ideology. But is it possible that 250 years ago, there was an effort by a small group of people to actually infiltrate Judaism and subvert it and try to destroy it from within? Is it possible that there was such a conspiracy that kind of planted the seeds, and even though that cabal is now gone and dead and finished and doesn't exist anymore, but the seeds that they planted have just grown in the last 250 years and turned into this monster? So that's really what I want to explore. Is there actually a conspiracy? Could there be an Erev Rav conspiracy theory? So I'm going to go through the historical, what was going on in the 16 and 1700s first, and then I'm going to present what is essentially a conspiracy theory. Again, it's not conclusive, but it has a lot of evidence to support it. I'm going to present it, and you can do with it whatever you wish. The best theories are the ones that explain the most things in the simplest way. So I think this is maybe the best theory out there that can explain a lot of these phenomena that we discussed on the far left and on the far right, and actually has historical evidence to support it. And then at the end, I'll come back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and why I think he was very aware of this and did everything he could to detach from it. Where does it begin? Where does this conspiracy theory start? Ironically, it starts with the Zohar. Why? Because the Zohar gives you various possibilities for when it might be an auspicious time for the end of days and when Mashiach might come. It gives you various possibilities. We talked about one recently, the year 1290, 1291. 50-50 on the Jewish calendar. When we did the class on the year 2025, I talked about that Zohar, that the Zohar looks at the year 1290 as a year when Emet Me'eretz Titzmach, this might be the year of Geula. It didn't happen, but that was a potential year, 1290. Another one that I've written about and spoken about before is the year 5600. We talked about that also in the Hidden History of Zionism class. In 1840, the Zohar says 5600 is just like the floodwaters began in the 600th year of Noah's life, so too in the 600th year of the sixth millennium, there would be a spiritual flood, essentially, and the world will get ready for the Messianic age. And that's what also inspired Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai to start his kind of Zionist, proto-Zionist movement. And based on the Zohar, Rabbi Alkalai said, we have an opportunity now. It's an et ratzon, it's an auspicious time, and we have an opportunity to go back to Israel and to reclaim our land. So that was the 1840 possibility. But between 1290 and 1840, the Zohar gives one more possible year when the Geula could come. What is that year? I spoke about it before once briefly. You remember what year that is?
1660, right?
Yeah, 1648. 1648. So the Zohar says in Midrash HaNe'elam, Be'elef Shtitai, in the 6th millennium, Lizman 408 shanin minei, 408 years into the 6th millennium, which means the year 5408 on the Jewish calendar, 5408, which is 1648 of the Common Era. Iyu kayamin kol da'arei Afra, so all the dead of the dust shall arise. So the Zohar is saying that this might be the year of the resurrection of the dead. 1648 is an auspicious time for the resurrection of the dead. And it's based on a few different psukim. The main one is in Vayikra, which we're going to read soon, about the Jubilee. Bishnat HaYovel Hazot, the Torah says, Bishnat HaYovel Hazot tashuvu ish ala chuzato. That in this year, every person shall, in the Jubilee year, every 50 years, each person returns to their ancestral plot of land. Do you remember this? In ancient Israel, whenever you did real estate, outside of cities, outside of centralized walled cities, if you did real estate deals in the countryside, it was only for up to 50 years. And every Jubilee, every 50th year, all the ancestral plots went back to their original tribal, whatever it was, delineations. So every 50th year, each person went back to where they were originally from in the tribes. So the Zohar says, what does that mean? Sheishtalem hazot. What is hazot? The Torah says, Bishnat HaYovel hazot. When will be, the Zohar says, what is the secret of the future Jubilee at the end of days? The word hazot, which you can read it as a year, because that's how we spell years. Hey is 5,000, ha, and zot, zayin, aleph, taf, is 408. So the Zohar says, u chameshet alafim ve'arba ve'tamanya, 5408. So it's as if the Torah is secretly alluding to the year 5408. And that's an auspicious time for the end of days and for the resurrection of the dead and for all the Jewish people and Israelites to return to their ancestral plot of land in the Holy Land. Now, what actually happened? Remember, the Zohar was first published in the 13th century, and it goes back even earlier to the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but it was first published in the 13th century. In 1648, that really was a monumental year. Historians might see that as the year that really shaped the future of the planet, because that was the end of the devastating 30 Years' War in Europe. At that point, that was the deadliest conflict in human history. Some say maybe it still is relatively the deadliest conflict in human history, the 30 Years' War that ended in 1648 around that time. And for the Jews, it was devastating too, because in 1648 was the Khmelnytsky massacre. The Khmelnytsky massacres, these horrible pogroms that killed like 100,000 Jews in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and all these places, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Eastern Europe. So for many Jews at that time, they looked at this as Gog and Magog, as Armageddon. Like, all these Jews are being slaughtered. There's horrible wars. This world war, basically, the 30 Years' War. They saw this as the end of days. And in the midst of that, there's the Zohar prophecy that says, hey, 1648 is the year of redemption, or potentially the year of redemption. There's a few possibilities that the Zohar gives. This is a potential year of redemption. And right at this time is this man named Shabtai Tzvi, who's this young guy, and he was born on Tisha B'Av. And you remember there's this old tradition that Mashiach will be born on Tisha B'Av. And he was born on Tisha B'Av, so he thought of himself as the Messiah. Very knowledgeable, charismatic, studied a lot of Arizal when he was young, based himself on the Arizal's Kabbalah, which is all about tikkun, about rectification, and about bringing redemption, bringing Geulah. So he said, we can do it. The Zohar says 1648 is the year. There's all these wars, Gog uMagog, the Chmielnitsky massacres. Let's bring Geulah. And people thought he was crazy. And at first he had very few followers. But slowly, he started developing a bigger and bigger cult following. In 1648, he actually staged a chuppah where he married a Torah scroll under the chuppah. And he felt like, this was his thing. Like, he's the Messiah, he's married to the Torah, and he's going to now liberate. And he started traveling all over. He was originally from Turkey, from Smyrna, one of the Romaniot Jews, not Sephardi, not Ashkenaz, neither. The Romaniots were their own distinct community, had their own distinct language, Yavanit, which was like a Greek-style Jewish dialect. And he went out there and started gaining followers. His original followers were actually a lot of conversos. Conversos, remember those Jews, Sephardic Jews that in 1492 and through the Inquisition were forcibly converted to Catholicism or adopted Catholicism just to get out of being executed by the Inquisition or avoid the expulsion, but then got out of Spain and went back to Judaism and reclaimed their Jewish faith. There were a lot of conversos at this time. And they were trying to find their place again in the Jewish world. There's a little-known book of Rav Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, called Etz Hadat Tov. It's not one of the well-known writings of Rav Chaim Vital, and the claim is that really who's the Erev Rav? It's really the conversos, these people that kind of have a Jewish past, but then kind of became Catholic, and now they want to be Jewish again, and they seem to have kind of mixed their Jewish beliefs with Catholic beliefs, right? That's like Erev Rav. They're a mixed multitude. They're a mixture of good and bad, of Tov Vera. And now we just have to purify them and rectify them. And if we can do that, we'll bring Geulah. The conversos really need to be rectified. They are the Erev Rav of the generation. They need to be rectified. And Shabtai Tzvi built himself partly on that as well. And he had a lot of converso followers, Sephardi followers. And then his following actually slowly expanded. There's a good essay on this, by the way, on Etz Hadat Tov, by Rabbi Gavin Michal on Kotzk blog. So I can actually link to it, where he goes into Etz Hadat Tov and how Rav Chaim Vital saw the conversos as the Erev Rav, and how they were really not bad, and they just needed a Moshe to rectify them. Yeah. And Shabtai Tzvi built himself on that. And then he also developed a massive Ashkenazi following that even dwarfed his Sephardi following, Shabtai Tzvi. And what he did was, he married a girl named Sarah. She was called Sarah Ashkenazi. She was an orphan. During the Chmielnitsky massacre in 1648, her town was completely destroyed. Her family was all slaughtered. She miraculously survived. And she was taken by Christians and raised in a convent. And she was there for 10 years. And then she escaped, also miraculously, and somehow made her way to Amsterdam. And she ended up being a prostitute. And Shabtai Tzvi had a vision that he had to marry a prostitute like the prophet Hosea, who God told him to take an Eshed Znunim, marry a harlot. So he said, I have to marry a harlot. Maybe it was partly modeled on Jesus and Mary Magdalene, because some say Mary Magdalene was a harlot, some say she wasn't, whatever. But it was maybe modeled on that too, because Shabtai Tzvi did see himself also as a kind of Jesus figure. And so he married Sarah, this Ashkenazi girl, who herself had an Ashkenazi following, who looked at her as this miracle child. And so he married her, and his following just grew. And he met a rabbi in Gaza named Rabbi Natan of Gaza. Gaza at that time had a big Jewish community. One of the Arizal's disciples actually was in Gaza, and there were many rabbis there and a big Jewish community. And Shabtai Tzvi made it to Gaza, and Rabbi Natan, who was one of the leaders in Gaza, saw himself as Elijah. He was Eliyahu, and he said Shabtai Tzvi is Mashiach. And really, Natan of Gaza made Shabtai Tzvi a big deal and became his main social media marketing guy and spread Shabtai Tzvi's fame. And it's ironic that it was Dafka in Gaza. The movement exploded from Gaza because today, all the people that support Gaza and say that Jews are foreigners and that it's Palestinian and whatever, just look up what was happening there in the 1600s, right? The Shabbatean heresy began in Gaza because Gaza was actually a major Jewish population center in the 1600s, which people forget today. Gaza was also very Jewish a few hundred years ago and not Palestinian. So that's Gaza. So it actually really took off in Gaza. But then, as the movement became really huge, and some say maybe as much as half the Jewish world believed Shabtai Tzvi is Mashiach, what happened? The Ottoman Sultan heard about this and brought him in and said, okay, yeah, what's all this messianic stuff you're talking about? You convert to Islam or we chop your head off. And he did. Right? Shabtai Tzvi, of course, to save his own skin, converted to Islam. And at that point, people realized that he was just a fraud, that he's just another fake, false Messiah, and the movement kind of ended. His closest 300 followers converted to Islam with him, and they developed this idea that the conversion was all part of the plan, that it was a yerida l'shem aliyah, that we're going to go into the klipa of the Muslim world, and we're going to kind of like break free from it and take whatever holy sparks are in Islam, nitzotzot, and we're going to rectify Islam this way, and it's just temporary. They developed a whole ideology about this, and then things just like spiraled even further from there, and Shabbateanism became its own cult with this whole idea of going into the klipa and trying to extract sparks of holiness from it, and they took it to a really disgusting extreme, allegedly. Yeah, we don't know the details because a lot of the things that are said about Shabbateans is from their opponents who tried to quash the cult. So a lot of the descriptions are really grotesque, but we don't know if they're true or if they're super exaggerated. But there definitely was some weird stuff going on among the Shabbateans, perhaps certain sexual sins, perhaps like eating pork deliberately or eating on Tisha B'Av or eating the Gir and Nasheh. They did all kinds of sins. The idea is that we're going to do a sin and then turn it into a mitzvah, which is really turning the whole thing on its head, which is completely impossible. You can't do that, right? The sages have a principle, ein mitzvah ba al yadei avera, right? You can't do a mitzvah through a sin. But they twisted that and gave it like a supposedly Kabbalistic thing that like we can go down into the klipot and take out the sparks from those impure places. That was their ideology. And then it just went completely off. And they started to do things that are totally forbidden. We don't know how bad they actually did. We know, for example, that Shabtai Tzvi was the first to give women aliyot in the Torah. So a lot of feminists see the Shabbatean movement as being like a precursor of feminism, of giving women more rights and raising the status of women. And sometimes they see it in a positive light. There's a scholar, Ada Rapoport-Albert, who's written about this. And I'll talk more about it. She's a disciple, really, of Gershom Scholem, and I'm going to talk more about him soon. Basically, Shabbateanism became its own cult. His closest followers converted to Islam with him. Other people didn't convert to Islam, but still believed that he'll be back, that he's Mashiach, right? There's always a second coming, right? Shabtai Tzvi, when he died, people said he didn't really die. He's even larger than life now. He's transcended his body. He's even greater in death than in life. Where have you heard that before? Right, many different places. He'll be back, right? There's always a second coming. Every messianic cult needs to have a second coming. Every single one. Because it's inevitable. Because when your Messiah doesn't accomplish what the Messiah is supposed to accomplish, what do you have? You have nothing to go on but to say, well, he'll be back. Instead of abandoning, because you're so heavily brainwashed by this cult, instead of abandoning the belief in the false Messiah, you just dig your heels in even more and you double down on it and say, no, he'll be back. And that's true for everybody, whether it's Jesus or Shabtai Tzvi or lehavdil, certain Chabadnikim who are still expecting the Lubavitcher Rebbe to come back. You always need a second coming when your Messiah fails to do what the Messiah has to do, there has to be a second coming. So the Shabbatean movement continued to exist with the belief that he'll return. And the ones that were in Turkey, his closest followers became what's called the Donme. The Donme were those who converted to Islam but retained their Shabbatean practices and some quasi-Jewish practices, and they kind of became their own minority, and they still exist today in Turkey. And at one point they had a leader named Baruchia, and he's the one that really turned it into like a nasty, weird cult, maybe an orgiastic cult, according to the reports. Not that it seems like this is still happening today, but at the time there was such a thing. And again, we don't know the extent. There's so much fact. We can't separate fact from fiction. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened with the Donme. Some people say that the Young Turks came out of the Donme, that Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey, was a Donme. Some say Erdogan is a Donme, and that he's secretly a Zionist agent working for Israel, right? Controlled opposition. So this is where I don't like conspiracy theories, because it goes too far and you don't know where to draw the line, and you start making up all kinds of things with no evidence, and everybody becomes Jewish, and everybody is evil, and everybody's an Illuminati and Freemason and whatever, and a reptile and shape-shifting lizard, and it just doesn't end. That's where the conspiracy theories go nuts. But there was this tiny group called the Donme that continued to exist in Turkey and still exists to this day. And but it doesn't look like they do anything strange or bizarre. They're just this minority group that are probably mostly secular. Anyways, now in Europe, Shabbateanism just expanded even more. And there were certain strongholds. Prague, the city of Prague was a major Shabbatean stronghold. Proznitz, all across Podolia, which is like Ukraine, Poland. And Vilnius had a big Shabbatean following as well. It is said that the secret leader in the mid-1700s of the Shabbateans was the infamous or famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz. You've heard of the Eibeshutz controversy, right? I've spoken about it a little bit before. The Emden Eibeshutz controversy. You heard about this? You've heard of Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz? He's a pretty famous rabbi. He has a lot of svarim. You can still get them today. He has some amazing, really interesting Torah insights. And he was the chief rabbi of the three communities, which is Altona, Hamburg, and Wandsbek. Now, he wrote a book. There was a book that appeared called Ve'avo Hayom El Ha'ayin, which was like really heretical, like took Kabbalah in the completely wrong direction, was super heresy. And it was discovered, the person who was selling these manuscripts of this book, he was at one point like arrested, and it was discovered that he had a letter that this was Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz wrote it, and it had his signature on it, and he was just saying, don't attribute it to me, this is for Shabbateans. And so that created in 1725 a massive controversy that how could it be that this great sage and Rosh Yeshiva and the chief rabbi of the three communities, did he write this Shabbatean totally heretical work? And so he denied it, and he wrote up a ban saying, he himself wrote up an anti-Shabbatean ban. But the funny thing is that even his ban had Shabbatean language in it. So he didn't actually excommunicate. He didn't attack Shabbateans like other Shabbatean bans. He kind of encoded it in very soft language. So he said, for example, Shabtai Tzvi is a dead putrid dog. But the Zohar uses that term of a dead putrid dog to refer to Moshe and the Mashiach of the generation. Because the Zohar says that the Erev Rav calls Moshe the dead putrid dog. So when Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz is saying, Shabtai Tzvi was just a dead putrid dog, what is he really, according to the language of the Zohar, he's actually just saying that he's Mashiach, according to the Erev Rav. So he twisted it in language like that, and he didn't actually say anything he said, Shabtai Tzvi denied our holy Torah. Yeah, the Shabbateans believed that. The Shabbateans believed that Shabtai Tzvi negated our Torah and brought a higher Torah, which they call Torah de Atzilut, the Torah of the higher dimensions. So even in his own ban, where Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz was trying to defend himself, the things that he said about Shabtai Tzvi and the Shabbateans was not actually negative. And he actually used their own language. They would never see it as an attack on them, right? So anyway, the controversy died down. The controversy started again about 25 years later because people discovered amulets, kameot, that Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz wrote, invoking Shabtai Tzvi. And that, again, exploded into a bigger controversy in the 1750s. And Rav Yaakov Emden, at that time, the Yavetz, was like really against Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz, said that he's a Shabbatean, we got to shut him down. And other rabbis didn't know what to do because he was so famous and so popular. Other rabbis, the Pnei Yoshua, the Nadav Yehuda, said, let's try to like just hush this up. They didn't know how to deal with this, with the Shabbatean heresy. It's a big problem. And Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz sent letters to many rabbis asking for them to defend him, to come to his defense. And we even have the Vilna Gaon's response. And he said, I don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved between two giants, It's almost like by not defending him, he was kind of saying he was guilty by omission. But at that time, he didn't. Of course, later on, the Vilna Gaon would excommunicate various people that he thought were dangerous and Shabbateans and so on. So the big thing was, in the 1750s, Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz's son, Wolf, came out as a Shabbatean and as the leader of the Prague Shabbateans. And at that point, everybody was like, okay, this is weird. And Rav Yaakov Emden said, you see, I told you, I was right. This whole family is bad news. And Rav Yaakov Emden actually changed his name to Israel. Why did he change his name from Yaakov to Israel? Because like it says in the Torah, that remember Yaakov's name was changed to Israel. Lo Yaakov ya'amer od shimcha ki im Israel. Your name won't be Yaakov, it'll be Israel. Ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim ve'tochal. Because you struggled with great people and with divine beings, and you prevailed. So Rav Yaakov Emden said, you see, I fought all of this for all these years, and I've been vindicated. So he changed his name to Israel. Like I was right all along. So although the rabbinic authorities over time kind of said, okay, Eibeshutz wasn't really openly Shabbatean, and his farm still exists today, and it's still considered kind of kosher. But historians all agree, today we have all the evidence in the world that he was for sure a Shabbatean, and he himself actually followed Shabtai Tzvi's advice. Shabtai Tzvi told his followers, don't proclaim your faith in me vocally. Do it covertly, do it secretly, have it under the table. Don't be open about it. And we see in their own texts that they talk about this, that it has to be done secretly. Like we have to maintain our beliefs in secret. And in Podolia, in Eastern Europe, actually in many places Shabbateanism was very open, publicly open. There were towns where they were entirely Shabbatean. And you could be a Shabbatean openly and you didn't have to hide it. And people would reports say that they ate bread on Pesach and they ate pork and they did all kinds of weird sexual things, and maybe they engaged in wife swapping, and that was like some of the worst things that they did. And so all of that is not the conspiracy theory. All that is actual historical reality that unfortunately happened. The conspiracy theory doesn't start with Shabtai Tzvi, it actually starts with somebody else, which is, you know who it is? Yes. Who?
Lubavitch. Jacob Frank.
Not Lubavitch quite yet. But it starts with Jacob Frank. Jacob Frank, who was actually at one point collaborated with Wolf Eibeshutz, the son of Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz, and was a Shabbatean, came from a Shabbatean town, and also thought of himself as the second coming of Shabtai Tzvi. And he thought that he'll get the job done, and he'll finish it, and he'll rectify the world, and he'll bring the final redemption. A lot of what I'm going to say here is actually from a book by a historian, a contemporary historian called Pavel Macheko, who wrote a whole book called, fittingly, The Mixed Multitude. It's called The Mixed Multitude. And it's actually all about Jacob Frank and his movement, and the Frankist movement in the 1700s. It's a fascinating book. If you like history books, you'll enjoy it. It's dense. It's like, you have to really like the history. But it's really fascinating. And not everything that I'm saying is from there, but a lot of what I'm saying is from there. And Jacob Frank originally didn't have much of a following. And at one point he went to Turkey, and he met some of the Donmei, and it seems he even converted to Islam at one point. And it seems like he was part of the Donmei, and he learned some of their tricks. And then he came back to Europe, and he was a lot more knowledgeable and, I guess, charming and charismatic. And that's when he built a huge following. We don't know exactly how many. Some say it was only 2,000 or 3,000. 3,000 is a significant number. Some say it was as much as 24,000 in Poland by the height of it later on.
Also a significant number.
Also 24,000, correct, is a significant number. Again, we don't know the exact numbers. A lot of these numbers are coming from anti-Frankist pamphlets that are saying they're growing, there's too many of them, and maybe those numbers are deliberate, connecting 24,000 to Zimri, right, and the Midianite heresy in the Torah, or 3,000 to the golden calf. Those are probably not coincidental numbers. So we don't know the extent how popular they were. In 1756, people actually witnessed in a town called Lancaroni, people witnessed what looked like some weird orgiastic ritual that Jacob Frank presided over. And I'm not going to describe it, doesn't need to be described. But right after that, the chief rabbis of Brody issued a cheren, and they excommunicated them, Jacob Frank and his followers, and they had put another ban on anything Shabbatean. Interestingly enough, the Brody cheren defended Eibeshutz. They didn't want to open the can of worms about Eibeshutz again. So they said, okay, it's not this is something new. But they did a few things here with this cheren. They didn't just ban the Frankists and excommunicate them. This is very interesting. They said anybody under the age of 40 cannot study the Arizal. This is really where it comes from. This famous, you've heard this, that you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40. This is really where it came from, the Brody ban. If you're under 40, you can't study the Arizal, because they didn't want people to misunderstand it and be sucked into these Shabbatean cults. And you can't study Zohar unless you're 30. And you can only start studying these things if you've proved that you have mastery of Talmud. So that was part of their ban. So of course, in response to this, the ban spread. Other Beit Dins took on the ban and spread the ban. So in response to this, you see how the yeshivas shift more of their curriculum to just Talmud. And really the modern yeshiva system is born after this, after the Brody ban, which said, listen, the only kosher thing is Talmud. That's it. Other things...
But that's the Ashkenazi yeshiva.
You're right. This is all in Ashkenaz, exactly. That's why the Sephardi world never had this, because the Frankist heresy was in Europe. This was in Eastern Europe. And so Sfaradim never had this, never accepted this ban. Sfaradim didn't have the Frankist movement. In the Sephardi world, Shabbateanism died pretty fast. Once he converted, people said, okay, he's fake, whatever, and it kind of died down. It had a few elements left over here and there, but it died pretty fast. In Eastern Europe, because they had it harder, because they were living in so much misery and poverty and persecution and pogroms, I think that's one of the reasons why it stuck much longer there. And so this is where the modern yeshiva system's really born here, because we can't study basically anything. You had to first prove mastery of Talmud before you could do anything else. Yeah, so the yeshiva system switches to all Talmud all the time. And so Frankism had that. We talked about the problem of the Talmudism, that Jewish education in the Haredi yeshiva world is not comprehensive enough. It's all Talmud all the time. And one of the reasons is it was a response to Frankism. One of the reasons. Now, the rabbinic authorities were always after Frank to try to end this cult. And so Frank went to the Catholics. And he went to a bishop named Dembowski. And Dembowski took up the cause of the Frankists. And Jacob Frank convinced them by saying, we're being persecuted by the rabbis. And he said, we're not Talmudists, we're not Kabbalists, we just want to follow the Karaites, we just want to follow the written Torah. And he started kind of pandering to the Catholics and saying, no, we also will accept the Trinity, we'll accept the Virgin Mary. Jacob Frank later said that the Virgin Mary is his daughter, Eva Frank. So he started to adopt these kind of Catholic Christian ideas. So he won over Dembowski, who then started supporting them. And the Catholic Polish authorities were actually supporting Jacob Frank. And then the following year, they staged a disputation. They had 4 Frankists debate 4 rabbis publicly. And so many people came to it that they had to call in the army and put guards and control the population. And the story goes that the Frankists won the debate, supposedly. Of course, the judge was this Bishop Dembowski, who was a Catholic, who was on the side of the Frankists. And in response, he ordered the Talmud to be burned. Public Talmud burning in the city of Kamenets, that they started burning thousands of copies of Talmud. Now, how did it stop? This is an amazing story. Maybe some of you heard this before. Dembowski suddenly had a stroke and died. During this time. Yeah, just had a violent stroke, dropped dead. And a plague started at the same time. This is now, once he dropped dead, everybody's like, okay, let's stop this madness, things settle down. This part of the story, I don't know if it's true. The part that he died in 1757, when the Talmud burnings were happening, that's a fact. This part, I'm not so sure how much factual it is. But the way the story is told is there was also at the same time a plague started. And a lot of these Polish Catholics were dying in the plague. and they felt like this must be a punishment for our Talmud burning. So the plague didn't end, thus goes the story, until the priests dug up Dembowski's body and threw him in the same pyre in the town square in Kamenetz where they burned the Talmud. And when they burned his body there, then the plague stopped. That's the story. That, I don't know if it's factually true. Could be. Maybe it has true elements. But for sure, he died of a stroke, and that was right when this was happening. Now, how does the story end with Jacob Frank, the official story? It ends with a conversion, just like Shabtai Tzvi. Just like Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam, in 1759, Jacob Frank converted to Catholicism. 1759. On the same day, September 17, that Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam in 1666. Now, Jacob Frank converts to Catholicism. And this officially kind of put an end to the Frankist heresy. The rabbinic authority said, okay, it's over. They're Catholics now. Good. We're done with it. Once you convert, it's called a shmad, like you've been destroyed. We know you're no longer part of the Jewish people. There's no infiltration now. We're not worried. You're not a Jew anymore. It's over. So most rabbis were really happy about it and finished. We're done with the Frankist controversy. Just like Shabtai Tzvi ended, this is over. One person was not happy about this.
His mother. His follower.
His main followers, just like with Shabtai Tzvi, we don't know how many, but several hundred of Frank's followers converted to Catholicism with him. One person who was not happy about this was the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, lived at the same time. It's amazing, I've mentioned this before, that all these people live at the same time. Rav Yaakov Emden, the Vilna Gaon, Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz, Jacob Frank, Moses Mendelssohn, the Noda Yehuda, the Pnei Yoshua, the Baal Shem Tov. It's incredible how all these famous scholars, rabbis, people were all living at this time. Yeah. It's a time of great conflict in Europe as well. Upheaval, new ideas, enlightenment, all these things. So for sure, it's a time of change. It's a time of romanticism. People are trying to make major changes in the world. So you have the Baal Shem Tov, who is in total grief over this, and actually dies shortly after. Shortly after Frank converts, the Baal Shem Tov dies. And he blames the rabbinic authorities for this failure. And it's commonly said that he died in grief over the Frankist conversion. Now that seems strange. Why? Yeah, why? He believed that Frank could be rectified. He believed that the Frankists and Shabbateans could be rectified. They say that the Baal Shem Tov went down to hell and wrestled with Shabtai Tzvi. That's the story. And he took out whatever sparks of goodness was in Shabbateanism, the few good things that were there, he kind of purified, he filtered it. And that's how what led to the Hasidic movement was like a kosher outlet for false Shabbateanism. Like, let me give you want mysticism? Yes. You want redemption? You want Geula thinking? Great. Let me give it to you in a kosher way through Hasidism. So the understanding is the Baal Shem Tov almost went down to hell and did that whole thing, went into the Klippa, ironically, and took out the Nitzotzot, right? Kind of the same language that Shabtai Tzvi used, they say of the Baal Shem Tov. So they say that the Baal Shem Tov felt like he could rectify the Shabbateans and Frankists. And when that failed, and when they were now converted and have been detached and like a limb that was amputated, he was in such grief that he went bedridden and he died shortly after. Now, I think the way to explain it is because, remember what we said, this idea, the Zohar says that Moshe, the Moshe of each generation is fighting the Erev Rav of each generation. And it keeps reincarnating. So the Baal Shem Tov surely saw himself as the Moshe of the generation. So we can understand why he died from grief, I think. It's almost like, I failed again. It's like if I'm the Moshe of the generation and the Erev Rav now has converted to Catholicism and now it's finished, I failed to rectify them yet again. And why live? It's like, let me die and reincarnate and let's try again in the next generation. To me, it's almost like that. Like, why did he die right after this? It's almost like he felt, I failed to rectify them. I'll have to come back again in the next generation. That's the way I personally see it. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because there's something that Macheko says in his book, in this book, The Mixed Multitude, that really kind of blew me away. He says this, and this is going to bring us back to the question we brought up in part 1 that I said I'd come back to, which is the shtreimel and the Hasidic garb and the coats, those like shiny long coats that the Hasidim wear. Where did that come from? Because people always say, when you ask Hasidim, where does that come from? The one thing that you hear people say is it was the dress of Polish, Ukrainian, Polish nobility in the 1700s, and it was adopted from them. It was supposed to be something very honorable, something very high class, something very nice, and so it was adopted from them. And I've asked so many Hasidim over the years, why do you wear the shtreimel? Where does it come from? And I'm telling you, nobody knows. Nobody has given me an answer. I've asked some major Hasidic leaders. Nobody has given me an answer where it comes from. Nobody knows, it seems like. The classic story you get is like the story of there was one king, we don't know who, some king who wanted the Jews to be embarrassed, and he wanted them to make hats out of tails, out of animal tails. So the Jews at that time made such beautiful hats, they beautified that negative decree. That's the story that you hear. There's absolutely zero historical basis for it. Doesn't really even make sense. Where did actually the clothing come from? Everybody admits, anybody you ask, they'll admit, well, yeah, we adopted it sometime in the 1700s from the Polish nobility. That's pshat.
1 second, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't wear shtreimel?
No. Definitely not in the heat of Egypt. So that's the classic answer that you hear. Like Hasidim themselves will admit it. Yes, we adopted it. It's the dress of Polish. That part they're willing to admit. But how did it become? Why did you start wearing it? So Macheko says something in his book that really blew me away. He says, look, what happened when Jacob Frank converted to Catholicism? Part of the deal was that he could join the Polish nobility. And he actually became a Polish nobleman. And so at that point, he was allowed to dress like a Polish nobleman. So he writes, I'm quoting, external manifestations of noble rank became one of the most important semantic codes employed in Frank's teachings. Contemporary accounts mention that the Frankists who converted in 1759 immediately began to dress in zupans, long gowns worn by Polish szlachta, which was, I guess, the nobility, and to buckle on sabers. The traditional dress of Polish nobility became the standard garb of the Frankists. This is where it happens.
Yeah, but why the religious people?
Listen, wait. And he says, and the symbolic significance of donning the zupan, and especially of wearing the saber, was invoked by Frank on numerous occasions. So he goes on to say that Frank saw this as adopting the garments of Esav. Jacob Frank saw Poland as Edom, as the Catholic world, the Catholic Church. And he actually had a way of proving it. He didn't come up with this, one of the other Shabbatans did. Remember when we talked about the series of understanding Edom, we talked about Zipho, Tzfo. Tzfo was one of these people that was a descendant of Esav that is said to have gone to Europe and founded the whole kind of that connection with the Roman Empire. You remember Tzfo? So the Frankists would say that the gematria of Tzfo, Tzadi Pei Vav, is 176. That's the gematria of Poland. Pei Vav Lamed Yud Nun. So he says, you see Tzfo, Esav, the founder, the one that brought Esav Edom to Europe, that's Poland. The same gematria. So they saw Poland as Edom. And remember in the Torah, Yaakov takes on the clothing of Esav, right? He dresses up like Esav. And he comes to Yitzchak and gets a blessing. So Jacob Frank said, and he's Jacob, he's Yaakov. So he's saying, we're going to dress like Esav. We're going to take on the garments of Esav. Macheko doesn't say all this. I'm saying this. But we're going to take on the clothing of Esav.
You see in the writings of Jacob Frank that he's saying?
Yeah. So later on, when he published what's called the Words of the Lord, his sermons and things, he does talk about this, of dressing like Esav. So he makes a conscious effort, as Macheko writes, that they start immediately dressing like Polish nobility and taking on wearing their coats and also sabers, because only a nobleman could wear a saber. So what's the connection to how does this work in the Jewish world? So those few hundred Jews that converted, the Frankists that converted they weren't Jews already at this point, really, but the Frankists that converted to Catholicism, they were allowed to even wear a saber, and they were allowed to wear the garments with the colors of the Polish nobility and the saber. But Frank had many other followers that didn't convert to Catholicism and stayed Jewish. Only a small handful of his followers converted with him. Others remained in the Eastern Europe as closet Frankists, outwardly Jewish. And they started to adopt the clothing, but black and white. So the colorful zupans and coats were worn by those that converted to Catholicism with a saber. But the Frankists that remained in the Jewish world, they couldn't have a saber, and they couldn't wear the colorful ones, but they wore black and white ones. And the hats. Doesn't mean that anybody who wears a fur hat is Erev Rav. Obviously not. First of all, fur hats you wear in cold countries. Fine. But this is a particular type of embellished, massive hat that has nothing, it's not a toque, right? This is something particularly, it's something like decorative. It's not really for warmth. It's a decorative, very oversized, large, prominent hat that was originally like a nobleman's hat. So the hats they adopted at this point, and again, I'm not saying that anybody who wears a shtreimel today is automatically Erev Rav. I have friends who wear a shtreimel. That doesn't mean, I don't think they're Erev Rav. I know great rabbis who are wonderful rabbis and who are on the right path and say a lot of the same things that I say, but still wear a shtreimel on Shabbat, as just out of custom. But the problem is that they don't know where it comes from. And when I ask them, do you know where, nobody knows where this actually comes from. But they think because it's a custom and now it's now it's Jewish dress, which is ironic because it's completely not Jewish dress. And Jacob Frank was the one that adopted it as the dress of Esav, which is deeply problematic because, we're talking about bringing Geula. And how do we really bring about Geula? If you remember, what the Midrash says that there was, in the merit of a few things, the Israelites were saved from Egypt. And there's a few versions of this Midrash, and later sources change it up. But one of the originals in Midrash Lekach Tov actually said, what were the three things that the Israelites in Egypt preserved? And in the merit of that, they were redeemed from Egypt. It says, Melamed shayu Yisrael metzuyanim sham. We say that in the Agadah. What does that mean, metzuyanim? She'aya malbusham uma'achlam ulshonam meshunim min hamitzriim. That they didn't change. They merited to be redeemed because they didn't change three things. Their dress, because they had their own Hebrew Israelite dress. They didn't dress like Egyptians. And their food and their diet, specifically, I think not eating Gita Nasheh and things like that. And ulshonam, and their language. They spoke Hebrew. They preserved the Hebrew language. So dress is a big deal. We were saved originally because we preserved our own dress. So if you're thinking about, because we didn't adopt the dress of the Egyptians, so how can we have Geula when you're adopting and admitting that this is the dress of Polish nobility, adopting the dress of Polish nobility? How do we expect to have Geula? It's a Galut mindset. It's dressing like you did in Poland in the Galut. And the worst part of it is that it looks like it started with Jacob Frank. Also, Leshonam, we should mention, that they didn't change their language. They preserved the Hebrew holy tongue. And often the same people that wear a shtreimel also speak Yiddish and think that this is Yiddish, like this is Judaism, right? And they want to preserve Yiddish, which is a German dialect. It's like weird that how deeply that idea is infiltrated, that somehow Yiddish is this language of the Jews. It's not. It's a German dialect of exile. It's a Galut language. And if we want Geula, we have to switch to our language, which is really Hebrew, as much as possible, and be conversant in Hebrew, be able to speak our own divine language.
Do you find a solid link between the Frankists and then the pervasive adoption of this by the...
That's where I want to go. I want to get to the conspiracy theory. Right? Where's the conspiracy? It could have been a natural thing.
This is what some...
Yeah, so it could have been it could have just been fashion. Like some of these people started wearing these things, and then other Jews who were not Frankists started wearing it, and then Jews who were not Frankists were like, oh, that looks cool, I'm going to do that too. That's how fashion just spreads. So again, I don't think it was necessarily that this is a conspiracy theory to make all Jews, subvert them into wearing this Polish clothing to dress like Esav. I think it could have just spread, again, organically, that it started with the Frankists, and then it just spread like fashion tends to do. By the way, what I was talking about in part one about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who refused to wear the Hasidic garb and the shtreimel, and when somebody sent him as a gift, he said, send it back, I don't want it. I think you can also start to see why. I think the Rebbe knew this. The Rebbe obviously knew his history really well, and I think he actually knew where it originally came from, and that's why he completely refused to wear one. Yeah, that's my opinion. So, although he didn't speak about it, because again, I don't think he wanted to suggest that somebody who does wear one is somehow a Frankist or a Shabbatean, and I don't believe that either. It's just knowing the origins of these things, and if we know where it comes from, then we can make good decisions about what to do with them. So, of course, it doesn't make sense also to wear these hats in the 30-degree humid heat of Tel Aviv. So, anyway. That's my theory for the Hasidic dress. Everybody admits that it was adopted in Poland in the 1700s from the nobility, but nobody says why. And when I read this in Macheko's book, I'm like, oh, it's so obvious. That's exactly it. This is the origin of it. And if only more people knew where it came from. And this is Mamasha Galut clothing that Jacob Frank explicitly said, we're going to adopt the clothing of Esav. And he saw Poland he had a gematria to prove it, as Edom, as Tzfo. So this is where the conspiracy comes in, and we're gonna end with this. This is where you have to take it with a grain of salt. Okay, I'm not saying this is fact. I'm saying this is what some people have this theory, and it seems to come out of Frank's own teachings, which is Frank said that all religions are wrong. Jacob Frank said all religions are wrong. All religions are a stepping stone. Kind of, yes, kind of. But that all religions are a stepping stone towards the final age, which has no religion. And people are completely free from any kind of law. The whole thing is very kind of anarchistic and antinomian. Antinomian means against the law, like anti-law. We're going to break free from all the laws. We're going to break free from religions. Then we're going to have world peace because all these wars are caused by different religions fighting each other. That seems to be Jacob Frank's vision. Like John Lennon, imagine a world with no religion, right? There will be peace, supposedly everything will be fine. That's Jacob Frank. So what the theory is, Frank said, look, this is what's going to happen. We already have the Donmei, who are Shabbateans that converted to Islam. They're going to slowly destroy Islam. Frank says, he converted to Catholicism. They're going to infiltrate the Christian world. Okay. And then there's going to be all those other Frankists that didn't convert to Catholicism, which will stay in Eastern Europe and slowly infiltrate the Jewish world. Hasidic, Orthodox, and I'm going to go more into the details of that. That was his vision. We're going to destroy Christianity, Islam, and Judaism from within through this subversive Shabbateanism. That's the theory. I'm not saying it's a fact. That's the theory. Okay. Now, if we actually look historically, did the Donmei destroy Islam? No. There's very few of them. Islam's massive. It didn't have much of an effect. Again, there are wild conspiracy theories that, yes, they did. They managed to make changes in Turkey. Okay, fine. But the wider Muslim world was completely unaffected. Even if they had some influence in the politics of Turkey, that's it. Right? And today there's whatever, it's finished. Again, if we look at historical facts, the Donmei didn't do anything to Islam. With Christianity as well, Jacob Frank converted to Catholicism. Again, they did have an impact on Polish society for the next several decades and even centuries. The Frankists did. They were fairly influential. But did they really change Catholicism? No. Again, there are conspiracy theories. Of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Catholic Church anyways, and people love to link the Catholic Church to Freemasons and Illuminati and the banks and the Jews, and there's, of course, a ton of conspiracy theories about the Catholic Church, but I don't think the Frankists really had any impact over there. The conspiracy theories will only increase now that Pope Francis died, and now we're looking for they're going to pick his replacement. My friend, Rabbi Harry Moskoff, who's really into getting the Jewish treasures out of the Vatican. And he's been there himself. He's written books about it, about getting our treasures back from the Vatican. He shared with me a piece about how there's an old prophecy, a Catholic prophecy, about the last popes. And it names Benedict and Francis. And we had Benedict and Francis, and that these will be the last popes. And now I saw today in the news that one of the front runners to replace Pope Francis is the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who's been living in Israel for the past 30 plus years and speaks fluent Hebrew. And has connections with Israel. So you can imagine the conspiracy, if he becomes the next pope, the conspiracy theorists are going to have a field day, right? You have a pope coming from Israel who speaks fluent Hebrew, who's got contacts in Israel, who has connections to the Israeli government and Israeli authority.
Probably the Hamas also.
Yeah. So that's, who knows? I don't know if he'll be chosen, but it'll be interesting if the next pope is the patriarch, the current patriarch of Jerusalem. So maybe there's some connection. You might connect, I mentioned in the Edom series about the whole Baphomet thing and the whole cult of Seir, which is connected to Esav, right? The goat demon thing. And that was really started in modern times by a man calling himself Eliphaz Levi, but he wasn't Jewish. People think he was Jewish. He was a Catholic. He was actually about to be ordained as a Catholic priest. And right before his ordination, he left it and started this weird Kabbalistic, obviously not genuinely Kabbalistic, quasi-Christian Kabbalistic, strange, demonic cult. And it may have been inspired by some Frankists. It's possible. I don't know. That's just speculative. But maybe that's how it got into. We talked about how there's this like demon iconography and goat demons in Hollywood and among the elites for some reason in the music industry in Hollywood. So maybe that's somehow related. I don't know. Others would say there's no conspiracy theory here. When you see this demonic symbolism and imagery in Hollywood and in the music industry, some people say it's not a conspiracy, it's just art, and people in art want to be provocative and want to get attention, so they do crazy things, and they'll use Satan in artworks and demonic imagery. It's just whatever. You have millions of different types of art, and it's just art. Some people make that case, anyway, that it's also just an organic thing. But maybe it's somehow connected to the Franks. I don't know. Overall, I don't see an impact that the Frankists had on Islam or Christianity or Catholicism in any way. Actually, Maciejko quotes a Polish historian who wrote in 1904 that the Frankists should be thanked for just bringing so many Jews to Catholicism. And they had fully integrated into Polish Catholic society and just became good Polish Catholic citizens. And that was it. So what we had discussed, though, is how in Judaism, I want to focus on the Jewish problem. And in Judaism, if you remember the Bringing Mashiach Today class we did in October about how certain Catholic elements have infiltrated Judaism. You remember I talked about 4 things: intercession, iconography, indulgences, the popification of rabbis, how that's entered Judaism in the last couple of hundred years. That's more where, how did these Catholic practices enter the Orthodox, Haredi, Hasidic Jewish world? And I think now we have an explanation. I didn't mention it then, but I think this explains it, that these Catholic elements entered the ultra-Orthodox world through that Frankist connection. And of course, we have to get rid of it and restore the authentic Orthodox Judaism, which is amazing. Also, Maciejko points out, he says that the first historical use of the term Orthodox Jew, who was the first person to use that term, Orthodox Jew? It was actually a Lutheran scholar who used that term. His name was Frederick David Megerlin. And who did he use the term Orthodox Jew on?
Jesus.
No. He called Rav Yaakov Emden the Orthodox one in the debate against Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz. Amazingly. So orthodoxy really is protecting ourselves from the Shabbatean, Frankist, Catholic influence and infiltration. So let's finish I only covered like one half of it, but I want to just finish this. There are, again, the conspiracy theories go wild with this. Some will say that Frank infiltrated the Freemasons. He made contact with Freemasons. He sent his followers to Freemasonry lodges, Illuminati. Like, the conspiracy theories go wild. Again, very speculative. And that's the problem with conspiracy theories, that it starts with a kernel of truth, but then it explodes into something way wacky. And we have to also maintain some sanity and logic here. So I want to focus on what happened to the Jewish connection. So we've seen a little bit how it entered ultra-Orthodoxy, and now we can also understand why the Vilna Gaon was so opposed to it, because he was in Vilna, which was at one point a Shabbatean stronghold. He wanted nothing to do with anything that was even remotely sounded like Shabbateanism. That's why he opposed Hasidism and refused to meet the Alter Rebbe, the Baal HaTanya. So he was very sensitive to this. The conspiracy theory is that the Frankists would, in Eastern Europe, invade the religious world. In Western Europe, they would invade what was happening there, which is Reform and Haskalah and they would actually impact both Reform Judaism and ultra-Orthodox Judaism and pull both to two extremes. This is what's going to happen. They're going to make the ultra-Orthodox world, this is the theory, so ridiculous, they're going to push stringencies and halachas to such an extreme that nobody would want to keep it. That's how we're going to destroy it. We're going to make it so ultra, so absurd, so ridiculous that nobody will want to do it.
I'll tell you the problem with that right away.
Yeah.
You see that without making this an explicit program, that leadership will do that automatically.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting. Right, exactly. I'm getting to that. That's what I actually want to say. That it's not a formal conspiracy like a ball that group comes together and says, okay, what's the next thing that we can do to drive people crazy? It's just you seed an idea. You plant an idea. I'll give you an example. This whole thing among some Hasidim for women to shave their heads after they get married. That also emerged during this time. Think about how purely insane that is. It's so contrary to everything the Torah stands for. About a woman's beauty, about, the Gemara says it all over, Ein isha ela layofi, that the whole point of a man, that the woman preserves her hair for her husband, that this is her sense of there's the energy there, there's this, that. Whatever it is about all of that, I don't even want to, it's so absurd, the idea of taking a young woman who just got married and shaving her head. And then the further absurdity of then covering her head with a wig. The whole thing just makes no sense. And it's devastating to a lot of these women who will often leave those communities and then say, some of them say I was okay with it because I knew my whole life that this is going to happen, so it was still weird, but I was okay with it. Others were totally devastated. Others look at themselves in the mirror and think, oh my gosh, what the hell, right? And it's just crazy. And it's not just crazy, it's just people also from the outside look at that and say, Jews do this stuff? My wife had a client who was a Hasidic woman. And then when the woman left, my wife's coworker, who's not Jewish, came up and said, oh, I feel so bad for that woman. She probably just had cancer and lost all her hair. And she's wearing the wig now. And my wife's no, she's just Hasidic. It's just what they do. And obviously the person is shocked. What? Why would you do that? Yeah. So, that's a practice where you think, where did this come from? It's completely illogical to force a young woman after her wedding to shave off her hair. It's just a pure insanity. And people say no, we have to be respectful, but it's a custom. It's a beautiful custom no, it's not beautiful. It's crazy. And where did it come from? And why is it there? And it came from this time. To me, the only explanation for this is Frankist infiltration, saying we're going to make Judaism so stupid that nobody will want to do it. It'll be devastating. And it'll be so repulsive that nobody would want to be part of it.
But then how did someone pick that up to begin with?
You only need one rabbi to start this, and very quickly it spreads. Yeah. That's how most of these customs start. They start with one person who does it, and then his followers do it. Right? It just takes one community to do it.
You have to get to someone who's generally incredibly respected,
right,
and respected for his
tradition,
his
yes.
scholarship. So
right. If Rav Yonatan Eibeshutz, who was a chief rabbi of the three communities, had thousands of people under his command, and he was a secret Shabbatean.
And you would think...
I'll give you more examples. So the idea was we're going to make one side super extreme and destroy it, make it repulsive because it's too much. Again, the anakim of the Erev Rav. And the other side is the Refaim of the Erev Rav. We're going to go reform in Haskalah and do the other thing, the other way, and make it super antinomian and cut it down. And so from both, that's the Refaim and the Anakim. That's the Erev Rav playbook. We're going to destroy it from both sides. And whether you believe the theory or not, that's actually what happened. Because the reality in the last 200 years is that's exactly what happened. 90% of Jews today are completely secular. Not Reform, not ultra-Orthodox. No, but these two extremes pushed people away from them to nothing. That's what's happened. So whether you believe the conspiracy theory or not, that is the historical reality. Right? It happened one way or another. And why did this happen? So Reform made this fake Judaism, destroyed halacha, moved people away from actual Torah law, then made people secular. It's just a gateway to secularism and ultra-Orthodoxy in the other direction. So how did they actually accomplish this? which is Reuben's question. How did they accomplish this? Gershom Scholem, the person who really went into this, was Gershom Scholem. You've heard of Gershom Scholem? I've mentioned him before. He was like the first official professor of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is like the expert on this, and he's not alive anymore. This is the last century. He was the expert. He studied Kabbalah in and out. Like, he was the world expert on Kabbalah. Incredible. If you read his books, wow, Yeah, he was interesting because he wasn't fully secular. He wasn't fully religious, but he wasn't really secular either. He's not studied in the Orthodox world. People are kind of afraid to study his things. But I know personally, in 2018, I started reading. I bought a bunch of his books. It was very transformative. I thought by then that I had already known Kabbalah. I was learning it for around 10 years by then. I told you this story before. So I thought I knew some things about Kabbalah. After I read Gershom Scholem stuff, I realized I don't know anything. I have to start from scratch. He systematizes it and describes it and goes through the whole history and points out all kinds of sources and svarim and ideas. Is really amazing. If somebody really wants to deeply understand Kabbalah, you got to read Gershom Scholem. Just from a scholarly historical perspective. I don't agree with everything he says, obviously, but just from an academic perspective to understand Kabbalah intellectually is really incredible. It really transformed my view of this. And then, actually, Gershom Scholem he was the world expert on Shabbateanism, and he wrote all about Shabbateans and Frankists. And back then already, in 2018 or 2019, I wrote a couple of essays on this, which this class is really based on. But I took it down from the website because it was just, back then, it was too controversial. So if you were subscribed to my blog in 2018, you probably have it in your inbox. But otherwise, I took it down. But this is really, Gershom Scholem was the first to point all this out. And I first encountered it back then, it was 2017, 2018. But this is what he writes. I'm just going to quote from him a little bit. He writes, when, after the glorious career as a great teacher, preacher, and rabbinic authority in Prague, Metz, and Hamburg, it was discovered in 1751 that a considerable number of amulets he had given in Metz and Hamburg, Altona, were in fact of a Shabbatean character. Another great uproar followed. So he describes the controversy. And Eibeshut's defense of the amulets was particularly weak and largely self-defeating. And he goes on to say, the secret Shabbateans in Central Europe saw Eibeshutz as their most prominent figure, whereas the Orthodox were deeply shocked by the possibility that an outstanding representative of rabbinic and Kabbalistic spirituality might have leanings towards heretical ideas. Many of them refused to entertain such a possibility and stood by him. The confusion even in the camp of Orthodox Kabbalists was considerable, and they too were divided. So he goes on to describe all the issues and the controversy. And much ambiguity was permitted by the widespread heretical principle that the true believer must not appear to be what he really was, and that this simulation was legitimate in a period where redemption had taken place in the secret heart of the world, but not yet in the realm of nature and history. People were allowed to deny their true belief in public in order to conceal their conservation of the holy faith. This went so far that a work presenting a summary of Shabbatean theology, like Jacob Koppel Lifshitz Sharei Gan Eden, written in the early years of the 18th century in Volhynia, was preceded by a preface vehemently denouncing the Shabbatean heresy. So what they would do is, and Scholem brings other examples, they'll write a Shabbatean text, but start it with an introduction saying that this is anti-Shabbatean. Deliberately. That's how they would do this subversion. So you would think that it's kosher. There's full proof, he continues, that a fair number of men of great Talmudic learning and even officiating rabbis joined these groups and found it possible to live in a state of high tension between outward orthodoxy and inward antinomianism, meaning breaking Torah law, that perforce destroyed the unity of their Jewish identity. In places like Prague, a number of highly respected families formed a nucleus of secret believers, and there's evidence that in some places influential court Jews protected the sectarians or belonged to them. Kabbalists and Baalei Shem became known in Germany and England between 1748 and 1750, such as Chaim Shmuel Yaakov Falk, the Baal Shem of London, and Moses David Podheitzer, a close associate of Eibeshutz in Hamburg, came from these circles. And he even, listen to this, the heated controversy about the revelations of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. The Ramchal was also accused of being a Shabbatean. Remember, he was also almost excommunicated and kicked out of Italy and kicked out of Amsterdam. In Padua, which began in 1727. He lived at this time too, the Ramchal. and the messianic tendencies of his group engaged much attention the following 10 years. Although even in their secret writings, Luzzatto, Moses David Valli, right, the Ramat Valli, who was one of his contemporaries, and their companions repudiated the claims of Shabtai Tzvi and his followers. They were without a doubt deeply influenced by some of the paradoxical teachings of Shabbatean Kabbalah, especially those concerning the metaphysical history of the Messiah's soul in the realm of the Klipot. Now, Gershom Scholem is going to qualify this and explain it. Luzzatto formulated these ideas in a manner which removed the obviously heretical elements, but still reflected in his polemics against the Shabbateans much of their spiritual universe. He even tried to find a place for Shabtai Tzvi, though not a messianic one in his scheme of things. The idea of an apostate Messiah was utterly unacceptable to him, as were the antinomian consequences drawn by the Donme and their sympathizers, but his claims to heavenly inspiration and novel Kabbalistic revelations, coming as they did immediately after the excommunication of sectarians in 1725 and 1726, aroused grave apprehensions in Italy and some places in Germany that had special experiences with Shabbateanism. And he says, similarly, a generation later, the first antagonists of latter-day Polish Hasidism suspected it to be nothing but a new branch of Shabbateanism. In both cases, the suspicions were wrong, but they had some foundation in their teachings and behavior of the newcomers. So Gershom Scholem is saying the Ramchal was not a Shabbatean, the original Hasidim and the Baal Shem Tov was not a Shabbatean, but they were influenced by Shabbateanism, and they admitted to. The Ramchal and the Baal Shem Tov did admit to taking some of the holy sparks of Shabbateanism and trying to kosher it and give it like a positive outlet. So that's also, this is the difficulty with this and why it's so dangerous and why people don't want to talk about it, because how far does the subversion go? And how do you know who to trust? That's the dangerous infiltration of Erev Rav. Now, again, I agree with Gershom Scholem. I don't think the Ramchal or the Besht were Shabbateans. I understand what they were trying to do. So the Baal Shem Tov, Scholem writes that the Baal Shem Tov, one of his favorite books, was a book called Sefer HaTzoref, which was written by a Shabbatean, 100% a Shabbatean. And the Baal Shem Tov used it. It was one of his favorite books. And it was written by a man named Yoshua Cheshel HaTzoref. He wrote this book that was all based on Shabbateanism. He saw himself as Mashiach ben Yosef and Shabtai Tzvi as Mashiach ben David. Sefer HaTzoref, Gershom Scholem writes, came into the hands of Israel ben Eliezer Baal Shem Tov, the founder of later Hasidism, and were held in high esteem by him in his circle. In his last years, Heschel Tzoref moved to Krakow and encouraged the new movement of Shabbatean Hasidim. So this book also did influence some Hasidism later. So you can see how ideas can spread even subtly. And Scholem writes also that the infiltration happened in the Reform world as well. He writes, the hopes and beliefs of the last Shabbateans caused them to be particularly susceptible to the millennial winds of the times, even while still believers. In fact, precisely because they were believers, they had been drawing closer to the spirit of Haskalah all along, so that when the flame of their faith finally flickered out, they soon reappeared as leaders of Reform Judaism, secular intellectuals, or simply complete and indifferent skeptics. It was surely no accident that a city like Proznitz, which served as a center for the Haskalah in Moravia, upon the movement spread there one generation earlier, was also a bastion of Shabbateanism in that country. So he writes about how they entered the school of Mendelssohn and biblical criticism and that whole era group of people. And in another book, Gershom Scholem writes, around 1850, a consciousness of this link between Shabbateanism and Reform was still alive. In circles close to the moderate Reform movement, a very remarkable and undoubtedly authentic tradition had it that Aaron Horin, the first pioneer of Reform Jewry in Hungary, was in his youth a member of the Shabbatean group in Prague. Proznitz and Hamburg, both in the 18th century centers of Shabbatean propaganda and the scene of bitter struggles between the Orthodox and the heretics or their sympathizers, were the chief strongholds of the Reform movement in the beginning of the 19th century. The sons of those Frankists in Prague, who in 1800 still pilgrimaged to Offenbach, the seat of Frank's successors, and who educated their children in the spirit of this mystical sect, were among the leaders in 1832 of the first Reform organization in Prague. The writings of Jonas Whaley himself, the spiritual leader of the Prague mystics around 1800s, already display an astonishing mixture of mysticism and rationalism, from which it is clear that his particular pantheon had room for Moses Mendelssohn and Immanuel Kant side by side with Shabtai Tzvi and Yitzhak Luria, and as late as 1864, his nephew, writing in New York, lengthily praises in his testament his Shabbatean and Frankist ancestors. So there's more to this. Scholem's basically saying that a lot of the early reformers were Frankists, openly so. They left the Frankist movement. They founded the first Reform in Hungary, in Prague. then they came to New York. You see the link here. And that'll explain why, in America in particular, reform went so far to the left. And if you remember the first graduation of Reform rabbis in Cincinnati was called the Treif Banquet. They were proud of the fact that they were eating treif and that they were breaking Torah law and no longer halachic, and they were calling themselves Reform rabbis. How does that happen? Right? Again, originally Reform in the early 1800s, late 1700s, if you look at their arguments, they had good arguments, good intentions. They weren't breaking Torah law. They didn't want to do that. So how did it very quickly get infiltrated? Reform got infiltrated by these new Frankists that were coming in and completely transformed it very quickly, turned it antinomian and turned it into this far left direction. So you see on both sides. Gershom Scholem points out really how it infiltrated both sides, Hasidic and Haredi, and also Reform and Haskalah. And this is the conspiracy, the Frankist playbook of how we're going to subvert Judaism, create an extreme ideology. Remember, it's a da'at. Erev Rav is Gimatria da'at. And we're going to destroy Judaism by pulling it into extremes. And for us, our job is to bring it back to the center. Wake people up, educate people. This is not Torah, and this is not Torah. This is an extreme, and this is an extreme. So this is the theory, and you don't necessarily have to accept it. Again, it's a conspiracy theory, but it does seem to explain a lot of how we got here in the last 200 years, and there is a lot of evidence to support it. A number of books have been written about it. And, our job is really to study this history. A lot of times people ban history. In the Haredi world, there were those rabbis that banned history, said you can't learn history. Oh, why? You have to learn history. Those who ban history, they don't want you to know the past, because if you can control the past, you can control the present. You can control people now. That's what the Palestinians do too, right? There's no history there. People who support the Palestinian cause have no clue about the actual history of these things. If you don't know the past, then you're going to be clueless about the present. And that's how you can manipulate people. You create a false counterfactual history to support your cause. And that's the first step in manipulating people.
The Torah commands,
the Torah absolutely commands you have to study history in at least two places. Zachor Yamot Olam, in Parashat Hazinu, Moshe says, Zachor Yamot Olam, Binu Shnot Dor Vador. Make sure you know the past years. Binu Shnot Dor Vador. Understand every generation of the past. Figure out how you got here. Shal avicha ve'yagetcha, skenecha ve'yomru lach. Ask your elders, your teachers, your parents. You should know the past, or you'll be condemned to repeat it. Shal na le'yamim rishonim. Ask now to the first days. Go look into the past. Moshe tells the people to study history. I want to conclude with what I said about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then how he clearly tried to detach himself from this Erev Rav ideology. I believe, again, I didn't hear this anywhere. This is only... Obviously, he didn't tell me this. I think that this is what he did. I think he understood this really well. He did know the history. He did spend some time in Poland. He studied at the University of Berlin. He studied in Paris. He knew secular history. He was familiar with Gershom Scholem. I know he was. Gershom Scholem actually had a lot of respect for Chabad. And actually, I read my friend Rabbi Aaron Moss in Australia wrote, he's a Chabad rabbi in Australia, and he wrote an article about how Gershom Scholem's nephew became a Chabadnik. So he asked his nephew, what's the secret of Chabad? Why is Chabad so successful? And the nephew said something like, it's because we have a really good, devoted general. And Gershom Scholem said, no. It's because the general has a really devoted army. That's one. So Gershom Scholem did have respect for Chabad. But anyway, we said how I want to show you how the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think, was conscious of this, and a lot of what he did was anti-Erev Rav. I'm not saying that everything he did was perfect necessarily. Obviously, I've been critical of Chabad myself, and I'm not a Chabadnik, but just I think this makes sense. Though we already said that he didn't wear the fur hats, he didn't wear the long coats, the Hasidic garb, he didn't want it, never put it on, refused to even accept it as a gift, number one. We talked before about how he didn't go to Israel, and I think that was based on the Zohar saying that Moshe can't enter Israel until the Erev Rav is destroyed, and if he saw himself as the Moshe of the generation, he wouldn't be able to go to Israel. By the way, the Baal Shem Tov tried to go to Israel too, and there was a shipwreck, and he actually miraculously survived, and he went back to Europe. He thought if he could go to Israel, he'll bring the redemption, and he failed. And the Baal Shem Tov said, okay, it's not time. And again, what I was saying earlier, that he maybe thought of himself as the Moshe of the generation. So because he didn't rectify the Erev Rav, he couldn't do it. Why the Lubavitcher Rebbe sent his shlichim to every corner of the globe, I mentioned that before as well, even to distant places, to impure places. He started the Noahide movement. He wanted to bring Gentiles under the Kanfei Shechina, as the Zohar says. He was conscious of this task, that Moshe wants to rectify the Erev Rav. He wants to bring the Gentiles under Kanfei Shechina, even in the distant corners of the globe. Why the Rebbe didn't like this indefinite kollel system. He encouraged his Hasidim to learn, do your basic learning, maybe even get a basic smicha, but make sure you're productive, make sure you're doing things, make sure you're active, and you're working, and you do your own fundraising, right? Most Chabad rabbis do their own fundraising. They don't get paid from some central location. So he encouraged his Hasidim to work.
To contribute.
Yeah, to contribute, to do stuff, not just to sit and learn and be passive. And remember, the Zohar says the Giborim are those who use Torah for money specifically, right? And just take, and give nothing back, and they just want fame and fortune. And Chabad has a lot of Ahavat Israel, and they do give back an amazing amount. And the same thing with the Giborim, by the way. It hit me as I was thinking about this. The Giborim always want to take money. Those rabbis that take money. And I realized, what was the Lubavitcher Rebbe famous for? For handing out money. Like, people would come to him and he would literally give people money. And that was that's so bizarre. Like, who does that? Why would you do that? People line up, thousands of people, and you give each one $1 or $2. What was that? Why? A fresh, crisp dollar from the bank. Like, why did he do that? And I think symbolically, the pshat answer we know. He wanted to encourage other people to give to tzedakah. He would give them $1 and he would be mechazek rabim. You now go and do a donation, do a mitzvah. Okay, great. But I think there's also a symbolism there, that the Giborim always take money from the people, from their followers. The Lubavitcher Rebbe said, no, I'm going to give them money. I'm going to give everybody money. Think about the symbolic meaning of that. I think it was, again, to go counter the Erev Rav narrative and against the Erev Rav ideology of always taking money. He had people, of course, fundraise and support him and big donors, but he never asked people for money, his followers. He was always giving money. Amazing. And he didn't want to reverse the gender roles. He wanted to empower women, but also none of this Hasidic shaving your head stuff. He didn't want to take away the woman's place. Unlike other Haredi and Hasidic groups, they don't ban publishing pictures of women. Like other Haredi people in magazines, they'll white out women's faces. The Lubavitcher Rebbe didn't do that kind of thing. And he encouraged women to give back to and be productive, and they work as families, like maintain that traditional family unit and work together to spread the light. In halacha, of course, he was also trying to be more balanced, which is amazing because Hasidim are very strict, again, ultra strict with halacha, and Chabad is also. The Shulchan Aruch Harav of the Alter Rebbe is very strict. And the Rebbe himself was very strict with halacha, for sure. But it's very interesting, and I've spoken about this before, that he instituted learning Mishnah Torah. He didn't institute learning Shulchan Aruch Harav. He instituted that everybody should learn every day Mishnah Torah, the Rambam, which is what I've been talking about all this time. The Rambam is, the most balanced, the most complete, comprehensive halachic text. And he specifically said, you would think that he would say everybody should learn Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Chabad code of law. But he didn't. He said learn Mishnah Torah. Again, why did he do that? In a very subtle way. Like, I think he wanted people to know, remember, this is the core law, the Mishnah Torah. This is what you got to know. This is what you should study every day. Of course, Chabadnikim say he wanted people to learn that because of Ilchot Melachim, and because it has laws of temples and the laws of Mashiach, and other codes don't. But okay, that's a very small part of the Mishnah Torah. Yeah, too's little. He wouldn't institute studying the whole 14 volumes just because of this a few chapters of Ilchot Melachim, and he wanted you to study the whole thing. So I think the real reason, yes, he wanted you to know Ilchot Melachim, but he also wanted you to know what is the actual core halacha. And as I've always said, this is the balanced halacha. This is the real halachic text that codifies what our sages actually taught, oral and written Torah. Balanced in halacha. And we said before as well, he was not anti-Zionist. He was not anti-IDF. He supported Israeli soldiers. He dafka sent Hasidim to go put tefillin on soldiers and to support them and to strengthen them. He collaborated with generals, with prime ministers, met with prime ministers, worked closely with Israeli government officials, which other Hasidim would never dare to do. So in all these ways, he was very different from the Erev Rav ideology and extremes. And I think if you look at it from that lens, I think you can see why he did a lot of these things that he did. And so there's a little bit of an irony that since he passed away, there are those Chabadnikim who are waiting for his second coming, which is something almost out of the Shabbatean and Frankist playbook. Right? When Jacob Frank died, his followers also said he'd come back, because there's this idea that Yaakov never died. The biblical Yaakov never died, right? Aod Avichai, that Yaakov never died. So they said, you see, Jacob Frank also, his followers also believed he'd come back. It's always, every Messianic cult is the same. He will come back. So there's an irony that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was trying to be so anti-Erev Rav and trying to really bring the true Geulah, that today there's this again, maintain a belief in his second coming, which is really unfortunate. And I think he wouldn't have appreciated that. So that's it. That's the end of the journey. And that's what I wanted to share. And just to finish on a positive note, on a positive message. Again, this is a theory. It's not necessarily factual, but I think it explains a lot to how the Erev Rav became so powerful in the last 200 years, how we got to this point, which was prophesized, that in the end of days, the Erev Rav would be extremely strong, and it will be very, very difficult to detach from them, and they will infiltrate so many different aspects of our society. But now's our chance. That's how we also know we're in the times of Geulah. That's another sign that we really are at the end of days, in the messianic footsteps, Ikvot HaMashiach, and it's our job now to confront it, call it out, fight it, don't play along, don't sweep it under the rug, don't support the organizations that push this ideology, don't give them your money, don't sign up your kids to their schools, don't go to their shuls, make sure you're careful, look at who your kids marry, which families they marry into, all of that stuff. Look at your own community. Who espouses these ideas, question people about it. Why do you do these things? Why do you go to the school? Why do you only learn this all day? Why do you wear that fur hat when it's 35 degrees and humid and boiling hot? And why are you dressed like a Polish nobleman in Israel? Why are you wearing galut clothing? Why are you speaking this language? Why are you doing these things that you're doing? Why are you espousing these beliefs? Why are you waving a chicken over your head? Why are you, all of these strange things that people do? Why are you shaving your head? You're a young lady that just got married, and people who you know who are espousing these beliefs, whatever it is, call them out, ask the questions in a nice way, in a respectful way. Ocheach tochiach et amitecha, the Torah says. It's a mitzvah to rebuke people and pull them back to the true path, to the center path, and look at yourself in the mirror too, and see, do I have any Erev Rav beliefs? Have I been sucked into some of these false ideologies, false narratives, false modes of thinking? And let's get it out. The Erev Rav is rectifiable. That's why Moshe welcomed them. Remember, he knew that eventually they would be redeemed. They will be redeemed. And that's how we bring the Geulah. So let's do it together, and let's bring the Geulah. Okay, we'll end with that.